Nestled deep within the brooding shadows of the mountain forests lay the village of Eldermore, a forgotten relic of medieval times where time itself seemed to have decayed the walls and souls alike. Crooked cobblestone streets wound through the heart of the settlement, leading to the bustling market square, a stark contrast to the village's otherwise desolate aura. In the corner of the square, a modest curiosity shop cast long shadows, whispering secrets from an age long past. The healer who owned this shop was known as Morwenna, a woman whose knowledge of the natural world bordered on the mystical. Her reputation for holistic healing had spread far and wide, drawing both the desperate and the curious to her door. Their shop was an eclectic display of dried herbs and peculiar artifacts, each item steeped in mystery and promise. Bundles of lavender, sage, and wormwood hung in fragrant clusters, their scents intermingling in a heady, intoxicating blend. Bottles of viscous liquids glimmered like dark jewels, each promising relief from ailments that the village physicians could not fathom. Some villagers, their minds clouded by superstition and religious fervor, began to question the healer's talents. They murmured in hushed tones, their suspicions festering like an open wound. Morwenna's presence carried with it an undercurrent of dread, as if her knowledge of the natural world extended into realms best left unexplored. These seeds of doubt found fertile ground in the hearts of those already teetering on the brink of hysteria. The village had been beset by relentless storms and unseasonable frosts, crops withering under the assault of the elements. Livestock fell ill, and children were born weak or still. To many it seemed as if Eldermore was under siege by a wrathful deity, and the healer's practices were an affront to divine will. It wasn't long before a small, fervent group of villagers driven by fear and zealotry sought the counsel of the local church leaders. The village priest listened with a furrowed brow as the villagers poured out their suspicions. His dark robes rustled softly as he paced, his mind a tumult of doubt and piety. He was a man caught between his duty to his flock and his fear of the unknown, a fear that the villagers' words only amplified. The church leaders, fanned by the flames of suspicion and superstition, quickly attributed the village's misfortunes to Morwenna's actions. They spoke of her in sermons with veiled accusations, hinting at witchcraft and dark pacts with otherworldly entities. Morwenna and a small group of fellow healers gathered in secret. Their faces were drawn and pale, shadows of their former selves haunted by the escalating fear and paranoia that gripped Eldermore. Innocent women found themselves under scrutiny, their every action dissected and twisted into evidence of witchcraft. A girl picking herbs for a simple tea was accused of brewing potions. An old widow who lived alone was whispered to be a sorceress communing with dark spirits. Hysteria gripped the villagers with an iron fist, spreading like a plague through their ranks. Fear and suspicion festered in every heart, and soon no one was safe from the venomous sting of accusations. The air buzzed with whispered rumors and frantic glances as paranoia took root and thrived. They could no longer stand idly by, watching their world unravel. It was time for action, driven by the primal urge to root out the perceived evil that lurked among them. Heartbroken by the malicious rumors that painted her as a witch, she retreated to the solace of her woodland home, seeking refuge in its quiet embrace. Hysteria had seized the villagers, tightening its grip with each passing day. The townsfolk teetered on the brink of madness, their panic spreading like the dark storm clouds gathering overhead, ready to unleash chaos upon the land. Morwenna moved through the streets of Eldermore with the stealth of a hunted animal. Each step she took was accompanied by the ominous creak of cobblestones, the sound echoing through the deserted alleyways like the whispers of ghosts. In an abandoned chapel lay the entrance to the secret coven, a circle of women who practiced the old ways in the deepest secrecy. Morwenna had never sought their counsel before, fearing the danger of such an association, but desperation had driven her to this dark and perilous path. The coven was already in session, their voices weaving a tapestry of ancient incantations that sent shivers down her spine. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was not alone. And in the heart of Eldermoor's encroaching night, that sliver of hope was enough to kindle a small defiant flame. The air grew heavy with an oppressive energy, and the flames twisted into grotesque shapes, reflecting the dark intent of the ritual. Morwenna couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something ancient and vengeful. They had embraced the shadows, and with it, the power to fight back against the darkness that sought to destroy them. In the cold, austere confines of the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. The church leaders, faces lined with grim determination, presented their findings to the stern officials seated at the long wooden table. The village priest stood, his voice unwavering as he recounted the events that had plunged Eldermoor into turmoil. His words painted a picture of a village besieged by dark forces, a place where the natural order had been upended by the sinister practices. The officials listened intently, their expressions a mix of concern and righteous indignation. Action was not just necessary, it was imperative. The decision was swift and absolute. An inquisition would be launched, a systematic purging of those suspected of witchcraft. The path to Morwenna's secluded cottage twisted through the dense forest, a serpentine route known only to her and the ancient trees that stood as silent sentinels. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could momentarily forget the turmoil that gripped Eldermoor. The cauldron over the hearth bubbled softly, filling the room with a fragrant steam. As she ground the herbs with a pestle, her thoughts wandered to the villagers she once helped. In the grand halls of the royal court, the king, a figure of towering strength and authority, lay bedridden, his once vibrant spirit now dimmed by the ravages of age and illness. His son and daughter, heirs to the throne, stood by his bedside, their faces drawn and pale. They hoped that he would recover, that the illness that had gripped him would loosen its cruel grip. But as they looked upon him, frail and gaunt beneath the heavy blankets, their hearts sank with a weighted dread. The courtiers were filled with sympathy and fear. The king's impending demise cast a long shadow over the kingdom, leaving the realm faced an uncertain future, one plagued by intrigue and uncertainty. The king's daughter, her heart heavy with desperation and grief, sought permission to seek help from the local healer. But the high priest recoiled at her request, his eyes flashing with righteous indignation, claiming that the healer's practices were an affront to the divine. The royal court descended upon the village of Eldermoor like a shadow. The villagers watched with wary eyes as the king's entourage passed through. Among them, the king's daughter moved with a sense of urgency. The healer anticipated her arrival. The daughter pleaded for the healer's aid, begging for her assistance in saving her father's life. The healer knew the risks of aiding the royal court, of defying the church's decree and consorting with those accused of witchcraft. But she also saw the desperation etched into the daughter's face, the raw anguish of a child faced with the prospect of losing her father. A deal was struck, a pact forged in the shadows, sealed with a promise of salvation. The healer would use her knowledge and skills to cure the king's illness, to pull him back from the brink of death. In return, there would be no prosecution, no condemnation of witches, no further persecution of those accused of practicing forbidden arts. The witch moved through the corridors of the castle like a specter, her steps silent and purposeful. She reached the king's chamber, its door creaking open on rusty hinges as if protesting her intrusion. Inside, the king lay upon his deathbed, his once vibrant spirit now dimmed by the pallor of sickness and age. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion, met hers with a mixture of resignation and defiance. With a sense of grim determination, the witch began to chant, her words a rhythmic cadence that filled the room with an eerie resonance. The air seemed to thrum with energy, charged with the raw power of the incantation. The king's body trembled, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as he teetered on the precipice between life and death. As she disappeared into the shadows, leaving the king to contemplate the inexplicable miracle that had spared his life, she knew that the consequences of her actions would reverberate far beyond the confines of the castle walls. Gathered within the hidden depths of the ancient forest, the witch covenant convened. A ripple of fear passed through the group, their eyes wide with dread as they contemplated the consequences of their actions. They knew the risks of consorting with forbidden powers, of daring to challenge the authority of the church and the crown. They had hoped that by saving the king, they could avert the persecution that had plagued their kind for generations. But now, as the weight of their transgression bore down upon them, they realized the folly of their actions. As the moon waned and the shadows lengthened, a heavy shroud of mourning descended upon the castle. The king, once a towering figure of strength and authority, lay cold and lifeless upon his bed, his features serene in death. His passing had come swiftly, without warning, leaving the royal court reeling with shock and grief. The council, their faces etched with suspicion and fear, turned their accusing gaze upon the witches who had dared to save the king's life. They claimed that the king's death was not the result of natural causes, but a sinister plot devised by those who sought to usurp the throne. In the depths of the forest, where the ancient trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the air hummed with the whispers of unseen spirits, the witches gathered once more. As the flames licked at the sky and the air filled with the acrid scent of smoke, a solemn hush fell over the gathering. The leader, her voice a solemn echo in the night, stepped forward to confess, her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. She had given the healer a spell to kill the king, not save him. As the fire burned low and the shadows lengthened, the witches lifted their heads in victory. They had successfully defied the church, protecting their kind from persecution. The members of the king's court gathered with grim determination, their faces twisted with anger and resentment. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices thick with malice as they plotted their revenge against the one they held responsible for the king's death. In the days that followed, the Inquisition began in earnest. Homes were searched, altars desecrated, and innocent women dragged from their families, accused of consorting with dark forces. The news of the healer's betrayal spread like a plague through the village of Eldermore. With voices raised in a cacophony of accusation, they seized the healer, imprisoning her in a wooden cage. Inside the courthouse, the villagers convened a trial, their voices a chorus of condemnation. Accusations flew like arrows, each one piercing the healer's heart with its venomous sting. They spoke of dark magic and forbidden sorcery, of curses and hexes woven by unseen hands. But the healer and her coven stood defiant, their voices ringing out like a clarion call in the face of the villagers' hatred. But the authorities would hear none of it. Their hearts hardened by years of prejudice and mistrust, they condemned the witches to death. The witches pleaded for mercy, their voices choked with tears, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. judge's eyes rolled back in his head, his body convulsing as if possessed by some unseen force. And then, with a guttural scream that pierced the silence like a dagger, he fell to the ground, lifeless and still. The villagers recoiled in horror, their faces pale with shock as they beheld the gruesome spectacle before them. In that moment, the true horror of Eldermore was laid bare for all to see, a nightmare from which there could be no awakening. She was dragged from the courtroom, her fate now in the hands of a vengeful mob, her feet barely touching the ground. As the villagers closed in, their faces twisted with a grotesque blend of bloodlust and fear, the healer thrashed desperately, her heart pounding with terror. The crowd's jeers grew louder, a cacophony of rage and accusation as they encircled her, eager to exact their brutal form of street justice. They thrust her onto the wooden stage, their intentions clear in their vengeful eyes. As they bound her to the stake and set the pyre ablaze, she remained defiant, her gaze unwavering. The flames roared to life, licking at her feet, but she did not flinch. Instead, she stared into the crowd, her eyes filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve. Though she did not show it, fear raced through her heart as the flames crackled and grew. Abandoned by her sisters, she felt utterly alone and helpless, staring down the barrel of her imminent demise. Her fingers trembled and sweat trickled down her brow, betraying her inner turmoil. Despair washed over her as she realized there was no hope. It was over. The villagers had won. Sensing the imminent danger their sister witch faced, the coven swiftly gathered. With a collective breath, they began an ancient ritual, their voices rising in a haunting harmony. An incantation of forgotten tongues spilled from their lips, weaving a spell of their own design. The air shimmered as they invoked the elemental power of the fire. The flames responded, growing brighter and more animated, and tendrils of smoke curled into the ether, carrying their desperate enchantment through the flickering inferno, a beacon of hope to save their sister from impending doom. And then, with a deafening roar, the flames erupted into a swirling vortex of fire and smoke, enveloping the healer in a dazzling display of light and heat. But instead of consuming her, the fire seemed to empower her. The villagers watched in horror as her eyes blazed with a power that defied explanation. Just as the flames were about to consume her, she vanished right before their very eyes, slipping seamlessly into the glow of the raging fire. The villagers gasped in shock, their triumphant cries turning to whispers of dread as the blazing inferno swallowed her whole, leaving behind only the haunting echo of her defiance. She felt her body being torn between reality and the ethereal world, her essence slipping through the veil that separated the living from the beyond. With a triumphant cry, the healer unleashed her newfound power upon the courthouse, her hands crackling with arcane energy as she summoned fire and destruction upon the building. The stone walls crumbled like tinder beneath her onslaught, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks and ash. The villagers scattered in terror, their screams echoing through the air as they fled from the inferno that consumed their once peaceful town. But amidst the chaos and destruction, the healer stood alone, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, a harbinger of the darkness that had been unleashed upon Eldermore. The healer surveyed the devastation with a sense of grim satisfaction. She had unleashed a reckoning upon the town, a curse born of betrayal and vengeance that would haunt its inhabitants for generations to come. Alone in the heart of the dense forest, the healer knelt beneath the eerie glow of the full moon, her heart heavy with despair and desperation. Surrounded by the ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the night, she closed her eyes and lifted her voice in a plea for salvation. In a moment of startling clarity, a horrifying realization dawned upon her. The spell that had rescued her from the flames bore unintended consequences. She was now cursed, condemned to eternal isolation in a mysterious and unknown land. As the eerie silence enveloped her, she understood the full weight of her fate, doomed to wander alone, a spectral presence in a forsaken realm, for all time.